Daniel Foster had been counting for 23 minutes, 347 strokes of the mop across the same 8-foot section of concrete. The rhythm kept his mind from wandering to places it shouldn't go. Forward, back, left, right. The wooden handle had worn smooth in the exact places where his palms rested, grooves carved by repetition and time. The Brennan Aerotech hangar stretched around him like a cathedral built to worship speed and altitude. 12 private jets sat in perfect rows, their polished aluminum skins catching the early morning light that filtered through the massive bay doors. Gulfstreams, Cessna Citations, a Bombardier Global 7500 that cost more than most people would earn in 10 lifetimes. Dan knew the specifications of every aircraft in this hangar: maximum range, service ceiling, engine thrust, fuel capacity. The knowledge lived in his muscle memory, useless as a foreign language in a country he'd never visit again.
Men in expensive suits walked past him every morning without seeing him. Women in designer heels stepped around his mop bucket like it was furniture. 3 years of this. 3 years of being invisible. 3 years of safety. His hands, the same hands that had once gripped the controls of experimental aircraft at 40,000 feet, pushing machines past their design limits to find out what they could handle, now gripped a mop. The calluses had shifted. Different pressures, different purposes. He'd been a different person then. Captain Daniel Foster, Air Force Test Pilot Division. One of the best. That's what they'd told him at the funeral. At both funerals. The commotion started before he saw it. Rapid footsteps, sharp voices, the unmistakable sound of expensive heels striking concrete at a pace that meant trouble. Dan kept his eyes down. Looking up invited attention. Attention invited questions. Questions invited a past he'd buried so deep he sometimes forgot it existed.
What do you mean there's no one available? The voice cut through the hangar like a blade through silk. Catherine Brennan, CEO, 34 years old, built her father's regional aviation company into a $300 million empire in less than a decade. Dan had seen her maybe a dozen times in 3 years, always moving fast, always surrounded by people scrambling to keep up, always looking through everyone like they were made of glass. "Ma'am, I've called every pilot on our roster." That was Emma Parker, Catherine's assistant. 28, efficient, terrified. "Henderson is in Tokyo. Martinez is on medical leave. Patterson's daughter is getting married today." "I don't care about Patterson's daughter." The words came out cold, controlled. But Dan heard something underneath, something raw. He'd heard that tone before, the sound of a person realizing they were about to lose something irreplaceable. "My father just had a stroke. He's in a hospital in San Francisco, unconscious. The doctors don't know if he'll make it through the night." Dan's mop slowed. "And you're telling me no one can fly me there?" "Ma'am, we're trying." "Try harder." Catherine's phone rang. She answered it, listened for 10 seconds, and her face changed. The anger drained away, replaced by something that looked like a person falling from a great height with nothing to grab onto. "How long?" Her voice cracked. Dan had stopped mopping entirely now, standing in place, invisible, listening. "Just tell me how long." She listened. When she spoke again, the words came out broken. "I'm coming. Tell him I'm coming." She ended the call. Her hands shook as she lowered the phone. "They're saying hours, maybe less." Emma and another assistant made frantic calls. One paced in circles, phone pressed to her ear. The other typed desperately on a tablet, scrolling through contacts. Dan watched from the corner of his eye. His chest felt strange, tight, like something was pressing against his ribs from the inside. Walk away. Keep mopping. Stay invisible. That was the smart thing to do. That was the safe thing to do. That was what he'd been doing for 3 years. But then Catherine made a sound, Small, broken, the sound of a daughter realizing she might never say goodbye to her father. And before Dan could stop himself, the words came out. I can fly it. His own voice surprised him. It had been so long since he'd spoken more than a few words to anyone in this hangar. The silence that followed was absolute. Catherine turned first, slowly, like she couldn't quite believe what she'd heard. Emma turned next, then the other assistant, then the mechanics who'd been pretending not to listen. Their expressions shifted from confusion to disbelief to something that looked a lot like amusement. Dan stood there, mop in hand, water pooling at his feet. His uniform was stained, his shoes were worn, his face hadn't seen a razor in 3 days. He looked exactly like what he was supposed to be, a janitor who had no business speaking to the CEO. I'm sorry. Catherine's voice was cold now, controlled, the crack sealed shut. What did you say? I said I can fly it. Dan nodded toward the Gulfstream G650 sitting on the tarmac. That jet. I can fly it. Emma let out a laugh, sharp, disbelieving, like she'd just heard the funniest joke of her life. Oh my God, is he serious? The other assistant covered her mouth, shoulders shaking. Catherine didn't laugh. She studied Dan with the same expression she probably used in boardrooms, calculating, assessing, searching for weakness. Then she walked toward him, each step deliberate. Her heels clicked like gunshots. She stopped 3 feet away. You, she said the word like she was testing its weight. You're telling me you can fly a $65 million aircraft? Yes, ma'am. You, she stopped. Her eyes moved from his stained uniform to his worn shoes to the mop in his hands. The man who cleans my floors. Yes, ma'am. The assistants were laughing openly now. One of them leaned against a workbench, doubled over. Catherine, please tell me you're not actually considering this. Quiet. Catherine didn't take her eyes off Dan. What's your name? Daniel Foster. Daniel Foster. She repeated it slowly, tasting each syllable. And where exactly did you learn to fly, Daniel Foster? Air Force. The laughter stuttered. Test Pilot Division. The laughter stopped. Something shifted behind Catherine's eyes. Not belief, not yet, but calculation. Test pilot. Yes, ma'am, 12 years. 12 years as a test pilot. And now you're mopping floors in my hangar. It wasn't a question, but it demanded an answer. Dan didn't give one. There was no good answer. There was only the truth, and the truth was something he hadn't spoken aloud in years. Let me make sure I understand. Catherine moved closer, close enough that he could smell her perfume. Something expensive, sharp, like the rest of her. You're claiming to be a former Air Force test pilot, one of the most elite positions in military aviation, and now you're working as a janitor? I'm not claiming anything, ma'am. I'm telling you the truth. And why should I believe you? Dan met her eyes for the first time. You shouldn't. You have no reason to. But your father is dying in a hospital 300 miles from here, and I'm the only pilot standing in front of you. Catherine's jaw tightened. The hangar had gone quiet. Mechanics had stopped working. Ground crew stood frozen, watching. This is insane. Emma shook her head. Victoria, you can't seriously... How long since you've flown? The question was directed at Dan. He felt it land like a punch. 3 years? 3 years? Catherine laughed, but there was no humor in it. 3 years since you've touched a cockpit, and you think you can fly my jet?
I don't think, ma'am. I know.
You know. She crossed her arms. A lot of confidence for a man holding a mop. Confidence has nothing to do with it. Some things you don't forget.
Flying is one of them. Catherine was quiet for a long moment. The silence stretched. Somewhere in the hangar, a tool dropped. The sound echoed. "All right?" Her voice changed. A smile touched her lips, cold, calculated. "Let me make you an offer, Daniel Foster." The assistant leaned in. "Fly this jet to San Francisco. Land it without a scratch." She paused, let the words hang. "And I'll marry you." The hangar erupted. The assistants burst into laughter, loud, uncontrolled. One of them actually clapped. The other wiped tears from her eyes. "Oh my God, Catherine, that's brutal. Did you see his face?" They laughed like it was the funniest thing they'd ever heard, like Dan was a joke, like his offer to help was entertainment for bored rich people. Dan stood there, mop in hand, water dripping onto concrete.
His face burned, not from anger, from something deeper. The weight of being seen and dismissed in the same breath, the humiliation of offering something real and having it thrown back as a punchline. Catherine watched him. Her smile widened, but her eyes stayed cold. She was enjoying this, the power, the cruelty, the way she could reduce a man to nothing with a few words. Well, she tilted her head. No response? Nothing to say? Dan looked at her, then at the assistants, still laughing, then at the jet sitting on the tarmac, silver and silent. "I don't need marriage, ma'am. Just need to get you to your father." He set the mop against the wall, straightened his uniform, and walked toward the jet. "Hey, where's he going? Is he actually—" Someone should stop him. But no one did. They just watched as the janitor crossed the hangar, climbed the stairs of the Gulfstream G650, and disappeared inside. The cockpit was exactly as Dan remembered. Leather seats, digital displays, the familiar smell of aviation, fuel and metal and possibility. His hands moved without thinking, muscle memory. 3 years dormant, but not dead. Master switch on. The instrument panel lit up like a Christmas tree. Battery check. The displays glowed. Fuel pumps engaged. The jet hummed to life. Dan ran through the pre-flight checklist with the precision of a man who had done it 10,000 times. Hydraulics, avionics, flight controls. Each system responded perfectly. His hands weren't shaking. That surprised him. The last time he'd sat in a cockpit, his hands had shaken so badly he couldn't grip the controls. The therapist had called it psychosomatic response. The Air Force had called it unfit for duty. Dan had called it the end. But now, here, with the familiar weight of the yoke in his hands and the familiar sound of engines warming up around him, something felt different. Not healed, not whole, but close. Footsteps on the stairs behind him. "You're actually doing this." Catherine stood in the cockpit doorway. Her face had changed. The mockery was gone, replaced by something he couldn't identify. "Yes, ma'am." She didn't move, just watched him, arms crossed. "If you crash this jet, you understand what that means." "I won't crash it." $65 million. "I understand. My father's company, my reputation." Dan looked up at her. "Your father is dying, ma'am. We can discuss liability later." Something flickered in her eyes. She opened her mouth to respond, then closed it. Without another word, she moved to the cabin. He heard her sit down, heard the seatbelt click. Dan turned back to the controls. His hand hovered over the radio. 3 years. 3 years since he'd spoken to a control tower. 3 years since he'd requested clearance. 3 years since he'd trusted himself with the lives of passengers. But his voice, when it came, was steady, professional, like no time had passed at all. "Tower, this is Brennan 1 requesting clearance for departure, runway 24 right." A pause, then, Brennan 1, you are cleared for departure, runway 24 right, wind 270 at 8, visibility unlimited. Roger, Tower. Brennan 1 cleared for departure, 24 right. Dan released the brakes. The jet rolled forward, slow at first, then faster. The runway stretched ahead, gray and endless. The tower came back. Brennan 1, be advised we show no filed flight plan for your tail number. Confirm this is authorized departure. Affirmative, Tower. Emergency medical transport. Authorized by Brennan Aerotech CEO, on board. Copy, Brennan 1. Medical emergency confirmed. You're clear to go. Godspeed. Dan pushed the throttle forward. The engines responded with a roar that vibrated through his chest. 60 knots. 80. 100. The world outside blurred. White lines, concrete, blue sky. 120 knots. Rotation speed. Dan pulled back on the yoke. The nose lifted. The wheels left the ground. And for the first time in 3 years, Daniel Foster was flying. The ground fell away. Los Angeles spread below them like a circuit board. Buildings, highways, the glittering Pacific in the distance. Dan leveled off at 3,000 feet, trimmed the aircraft, and let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. His hands were still steady. Behind him, footsteps. Not Catherine this time. Someone else. Holy shit. Jack Morrison stood in the cockpit doorway. Head mechanic, 55 years old, former Navy carrier pilot. Dan had worked alongside him for 3 years without saying more than a dozen words. You're really him. Dan kept his eyes on the instruments. Captain Daniel Foster, Air Force Test Pilot Division. I served with you in 2010. Joint exercise at Nellis. Dan didn't respond. You don't remember me. That's okay. I was nobody. But you... Jack stepped closer. You were a legend, man. We all knew who you were. The guy who could fly anything. The guy who pushed birds past their limits and brought them home. Dan's jaw tightened. That was a long time ago. What happened? Dan finally looked at him. Life changed. Jack studied him for a moment, then nodded. Fair enough. But right now, I need to know something. Can you really fly this jet? I'm flying it right now. I mean, all the way to San Francisco. Land it. Keep the CEO alive. Yes. Jack pulled out his phone. Then I'm coming with you. Co-pilot seat. Because if this goes south, I need to be able to take over. Dan wanted to argue, but Jack was already moving to the right seat, buckling in, putting on a headset. Your bird, Captain. I'm just here for insurance. They flew in silence for a while. Dan programmed the GPS, set up the approach to San Francisco International, checked fuel consumption. Everything automatic, everything smooth, like he'd done it yesterday instead of 3 years ago.
You know the CEO's watching you, right? Jack's voice came through the headset. Dan glanced at the mirror. Catherine sat in the cabin, staring out the window, phone pressed to her ear. She looked small, vulnerable, nothing like the woman who'd mocked him an hour ago. She's scared. Jack said it simply, without judgment. Yeah. Her old man built that company from nothing. One plane, one dream. She turned it into an empire. But they haven't spoken in 4 years. Some kind of falling out. Dan didn't respond. He didn't need to know Catherine Brennan's life story. He just needed to get her to San Francisco. But Jack kept talking. You know why she offered to marry you? Dan's hands tightened on the yoke. Because she was mocking me. Maybe. Or maybe because she was desperate enough to promise anything. That doesn't make it less cruel.
No, but it makes it human. Catherine appeared in the cockpit doorway again. She looked at Dan, then at Jack. How long? Dan checked the GPS.
22 minutes to San Francisco. She nodded, started to turn away. Ma'am? Jack's voice stopped her. I've known your father for 15 years. He's one of the best men I've ever met. He'll pull through. Catherine's face crumpled for a second, then reset. You don't know that. No, but I know he's stubborn, and stubborn men don't die easy. She almost smiled. Then she was gone. Jack looked at Dan. That woman just offered to marry you. As a joke. Maybe, but she's also about to lose her father, and you're the only thing standing between her and that loss. That means something. Dan didn't answer. He focused on the approach, on the numbers, on the task. That's all this was, a task, not a moment of connection, not a turning point, just one flight. Then back to the mop, back to invisibility, back to safety. San Francisco International appeared on the horizon, the bay, the bridges, the city rising from the water. San Francisco Tower, Brennan 1, 20 miles south, inbound for landing. Brennan 1, San Francisco Tower, cleared for ILS approach, runway 28 left. Wind 280 at 10, visibility 10 miles. Roger, cleared ILS approach 28 left. Dan began the descent. Flaps down, landing gear deployed, airspeed decreasing. The city grew larger, closer. He'd done this 1,000 times, but it had never mattered this much. You're doing great. Jack's voice was steady, reassuring. Just like riding a bike, right? Bikes don't fall 30,000 feet. Fair point. The runway rose to meet them. Dan adjusted for the crosswind, kept the nose aligned, let the aircraft settle into the glide path. 1,500 feet. 1,000. 500. The wheels touched down with barely a whisper. The jet rolled along the runway, smooth and controlled, slowing gradually until it came to a complete stop. Dan sat back in his seat. His hands were still on the controls. Steady. Sure. Behind him, he heard Catherine release a breath she'd been holding. That was the smoothest landing I've ever felt. Dan didn't respond. He was staring at his hands, the hands that had just landed a $65 million aircraft, the hands that had mopped floors for 3 years, the hands that had failed to save Ryan Torres. They looked the same, but something had changed. For the first time in 3 years, Daniel Foster felt like a pilot again. Catherine was gone within minutes. A car waited on the tarmac. She ran to it without looking back, phone already dialing the hospital. Dan shut down the engines one by one. The instruments went dark. The hum faded to silence. You did good. Jack unbuckled his harness. Real good. I'll handle the paperwork here. You take the commercial flight back. First class. Catherine already arranged it. Dan nodded, too tired to argue. The flight home was 3 hours of sitting with his thoughts. He ordered a whiskey, then a second one. The alcohol didn't help. If anything, it made the memories sharper. Ryan Torres's face, the spinning aircraft, the alarms. Julia's voice in the hospital waiting room after they'd told him Torres was dead. You're alive. That's what matters. You're alive. But Torres wasn't, and eventually Julia wasn't either. Dan landed at LAX just after 6. He took a cab home, watched the city slide past the window. All those lights, all those lives, people going about their business, not knowing or caring that a janitor had flown a jet today. The apartment building looked the same as always, 3 floors of tired brick and narrow hallways, home for the past 3 years, ever since he'd sold the house. The house had been Julia's dream, Living there without her felt like wearing a dead woman's clothes. Maggie Wilson met him at the door. 73 years old, white hair always pinned back, eyes that saw everything. "You look different." "Long day." She picked up her bag. Liam ate his dinner, did his homework. He's in his room now. "Thank you, Maggie." She paused at the door. "He asked about airplanes today. Wanted to know if you ever flew them." Dan's throat tightened. "What did you tell him?" "I told him to ask you." She patted his arm gently. "Some questions only a father can answer." She left. The apartment fell quiet. Dan walked to Liam's room. The door was open a crack, light spilling into the hallway. He pushed it open slowly. Liam was sitting on his bed, a book open in his lap. 8 years old, dark hair that never stayed flat, eyes that looked exactly like Julia's. When he saw Dan, his whole face lit up. "Dad!" He launched himself off the bed and into Dan's arms. Dan caught him, held him tight, breathed in the smell of soap and peanut butter and childhood. "Hey, buddy. You're late." "I know, I'm sorry. Where were you?" Dan carried him back to the bed, sat down with Liam in his lap. "I had to do something at work, something important." "What?" Dan hesitated. He'd spent 3 years protecting Liam from his past, from the pain, from the complicated truth of who his father used to be. But Maggie's words echoed in his mind. Some questions only a father can answer. "I flew an airplane today." Liam's eyes went wide. "A real airplane?" "A real airplane. A big jet." "Was it scary?" Dan thought about the takeoff, the controls in his hands, the moment the wheels left the ground. "A little bit, yeah." "But you did it anyway." "I did it anyway." Liam considered this with a seriousness only an 8-year-old could muster. "Mom said you used to fly airplanes before." Dan's heart clenched. "She told you that?" "She said you were the best pilot in the whole world. She said you could fly anything." Julia. Even gone, she was still shaping their son, still speaking truth into his life. "I used to fly, a long time ago. Then I stopped." "Why?" The question hung there. Simple. Impossible. "Because something bad happened and I got scared." Liam nodded slowly, like this made perfect sense. "I get scared sometimes too. At school, when the big kids are mean." "What do you do when you're scared?" "I remember what Mom said." Liam's voice was matter-of-fact. "She said, being brave doesn't mean you're not scared. It means you do it anyway." Dan couldn't speak. His throat was closed, his eyes burning. Julia's words in their son's mouth, reaching across death itself to remind him who he was supposed to be. "Your mom was very smart." "I know." Liam yawned. "Dad?" "Yeah, buddy?" "If you fly airplanes again, can I come?" Dan pulled him closer. "We'll see." "That means maybe." "That means maybe." Liam smiled, already half asleep. "I think you should do it. Fly again. Mom would be happy." He was asleep within minutes. Dan sat there, holding him, watching his chest rise and fall, feeling the small, warm weight of the only person left in the world who mattered. Mom would be happy. Would she? Would Julia want him to fly again? Or would she want him to stay safe, stay grounded, stay invisible? He thought about the woman he'd married 12 years ago, the second-grade teacher with the loud laugh and the gentle hands, the woman who'd held him together after Torres died, who'd wiped his tears and made him eat and dragged him back from the edge of something dark. She'd believed in him even when he couldn't believe in himself. "You'll fly again someday," she told him once. her hand on his chest over his heart. When you're ready. When you remember that you were meant for the sky. 3 weeks later, she was dead. A drunk driver, a rainy highway, a phone call that ended his world. Dan laid Liam down gently, pulled the blanket up to his chin, and left the room. He stood at the kitchen window for a long time, watching the city lights, thinking about Julia, about Torres, about all the people he'd lost, and about the one person he couldn't afford to lose.
Liam needed stability. He needed a father who came home every night, who made dinner and helped with homework and read bedtime stories. Not a father who chased ghosts in the sky. Dan had made his choice 3 years ago, standing at Julia's grave with a 5-year-old in his arms. No more risks. No more flying. Just survival. But today had changed something. Today had cracked the wall he'd built around himself, and he didn't know how to seal it back up. The next morning, Dan went back to work, put on the gray uniform, picked up the mop, started in the north corner of the hangar, same as always. But nothing was the same. People looked at him now, whispered when he passed. A mechanic named Tom nodded at Dan and gave him a thumbs up. Dan just kept mopping, push and pull, left and right. Around 11, Emma appeared. "Mr. Foster?" Dan looked up. "Yes?" "Mrs. Brennan wants to see you in her office." "I'm working." "She said to come now." Dan set down the mop, followed Emma across the hangar, past the jets, past the mechanics who stopped to watch. Catherine's office was on the second floor. Glass walls, expensive furniture, a view of the entire runway. She was standing at the window when he entered, her back to him. "Close the door." He did. "Sit down." "I'd rather stand, ma'am." She turned. She looked exhausted. Dark circles under her eyes, hair less perfect than usual. But there was something else in her face, too. Something that hadn't been there yesterday. "My father is stable. The doctors say he'll recover." "I'm glad. I sat with him all night. He woke up around 4 in the morning. First thing he said was my name." Her voice cracked slightly. "I told him I was sorry. For everything. For the years we wasted fighting." "What did he say?" "He said he already knew. He said he'd been waiting for me to figure it out." She laughed softly. "Stubborn old man." Dan said nothing. This wasn't about him. He was just the janitor who'd gotten her there in time. Catherine walked to her desk, picked up an envelope. "I looked into your records." Dan's shoulders tensed. "You had no right." "I know. I'm sorry. But I needed to understand." She opened a folder. "Captain Daniel Foster, 12 years Air Force, Test Pilot Division, 2 tours overseas, Medal of Valor for actions in Afghanistan, commendation from the Joint Chiefs for..." She looked up. "You were one of the best pilots in the country." "That was a long time ago." "It was 3 years ago." "That's not that long." She closed the folder. "I also found out about Lieutenant Torres and about your wife." Dan's jaw tightened. "That's private." "I know. And I'm sorry for your losses. Both of them." He didn't respond, didn't trust himself to speak. Catherine held out the envelope. "This is for you." "What is it?" "A contract. I want to hire you as a pilot for Brennan Aerotech. Full benefits, competitive salary, flexible schedule." Dan didn't take the envelope. "I'm not a pilot anymore. You flew my jet yesterday. Perfectly, after 3 years without practice." She stepped closer. "That's not something that just goes away. I appreciate the offer, but no." "Why?" "Because I have a son. An 8-year-old who needs me home, on the ground, safe." Catherine nodded slowly, like she'd expected this answer. "What's his name?" "Liam." "Liam." She set the envelope on her desk. I understand wanting to protect your child. I do. But I also know what it's like to watch someone you love give up on themselves. I'm not giving up. I'm making a choice. Are you? Or are you hiding? The words hit harder than they should have. Dan took a step back. Miss Brennan, you spent 3 years invisible in my hangar, mopping floors, cleaning toilets, pretending to be something you're not. Her voice was gentle now, not cruel. I mocked you yesterday because I couldn't see past the uniform. But I see you now, Daniel. I see who you really are, and you're not a janitor. What I am or was doesn't matter. What matters is who my son needs me to be. And who is that? A father who's afraid? A man who runs from his past? She shook her head. Children don't need perfect parents, Daniel. They need real ones. They need parents who show them that it's okay to fall down, as long as you get back up. Dan's hands were shaking. He clenched them into fists. You don't know anything about being a parent. No, I don't. Catherine's eyes were wet. But I know about regret. I know about wasting years running from the people who love you. I almost lost my father because I was too proud to pick up the phone. She picked up the envelope again, held it out to him. Don't make the same mistake. Don't let fear steal the rest of your life. Dan stared at the envelope. His whole body felt tight, coiled. I can't. Yes, you can. You don't understand. Then help me understand. Her voice rose. Tell me what happened. Tell me why a man who could fly anything walks away from the sky. Because I killed someone. The words exploded out of him, raw, broken. 3 years of silence shattered in a single moment. Catherine went still. Torres trusted me. He was a kid, 26 years old, barely old enough to shave, and he trusted me to keep him safe. And I failed. Dan's voice cracked. The aircraft failed, and I couldn't fix it. And he died. He died scared and confused and calling for his mother. And I just sat there. I sat there and watched him die, and I couldn't do anything. His eyes were burning. And then Julia, my wife. She was the only reason I kept going after Torres. She believed in me when I couldn't believe in myself. And then she was just gone. Like I hadn't lost enough. Like I hadn't suffered enough. He was crying now. He didn't care. So don't tell me about fear. Don't tell me about running. I'm not running from anything. I'm protecting the only person I have left. Because if I fly again and something happens, and Liam loses me too. He couldn't finish. Couldn't breathe. Catherine crossed the room slowly. She stood in front of him, close enough to touch. Daniel. He couldn't look at her. What happened to Torres wasn't your fault. It was equipment failure. Nothing you could have done. I know what the report said, but you don't believe it. It doesn't matter what I believe. He's still dead. She was quiet for a moment. What would Julia say if she were here right now? Dan's head snapped up. Don't. What would she tell you? I said don't. Would she want you to hide? To spend the rest of your life mopping floors and pretending to be less than you are? She'd want me to keep Liam safe. And she'd want you to be happy. Catherine's voice was soft but certain. She loved you. I can tell from the way you talk about her. A woman who loves a man like that doesn't want him to disappear. She wants him to live. Really live. Dan closed his eyes. Julia's face appeared in his mind. Her smile. Her voice. I can't promise you won't get hurt, Catherine continued.
I can't promise nothing bad will ever happen. But I can promise you this. The man I saw fly yesterday is too good to waste. And your son deserves a father who isn't afraid to be who he really is. She pressed the envelope into his hands. Take it home, think about it, talk to Liam, and then decide. Dan looked down at the envelope. White paper, black text. A future he'd sworn never to consider. There's one more thing, Catherine said quietly. I wanted to know what kind of man you are. And do you know what I found? He shook his head. I found a hero. Not because of the medals or the commendations, but because when you saw someone in trouble yesterday, you didn't think about yourself. You didn't think about the risks or the pain or the fear. You just helped. She smiled faintly. That's not a janitor, Daniel. That's a pilot. And pilots belong in the sky.
Dan stood at the kitchen table that night, the envelope lying in front of him like an unexploded bomb. Liam was asleep. Maggie had gone home hours ago. The apartment was silent except for the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of traffic on the street below. He'd read the contract 3 times. Senior pilot position, $180,000 a year. Health insurance that would cover everything Liam might ever need. Retirement contributions. Life insurance with Liam as beneficiary. A schedule promising flexibility, time at home, no extended deployments. It was everything he'd stopped allowing himself to want. His phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. Liam asked Maggie about you today. Asked if you were happy. Thought you should know. Emma. Dan stared at the message. 8 years old, and Liam was worrying about his father's happiness. That wasn't right. That wasn't how it was supposed to work. He walked to Liam's room, pushed the door open quietly. His son slept on his side, one hand tucked under his pillow, the other clutching a small stuffed airplane Julia had bought him years ago. The airplane was worn now, one wing repaired with duct tape, but Liam refused to sleep without it. On the nightstand sat a framed photo. Julia, Dan, and baby Liam at the beach. Julia's hair was wild from the wind, her smile wide and genuine. Dan was laughing at something she'd said. Liam, maybe 6 months old, was reaching for the camera with chubby hands. They'd been happy then. Before Torres. Before the guilt. Before the drunk driver on Highway 101 who'd taken Julia away and left Dan with a 5-year-old and a hole in his chest that wouldn't close. Dan picked up the photo frame, ran his thumb across the glass. What would you say, Jules? The question hung in the empty room. No answer came. The dead don't speak, no matter how much the living want them to. He set the frame down and noticed something else on the nightstand. A small wooden box he'd never seen before. He opened it carefully, trying not to wake Liam. Inside was an envelope with his name written in Julia's handwriting. Dan's hands started shaking. He took the envelope to the kitchen, sat down under the harsh fluorescent light, and opened it with fingers that felt numb. The letter was dated 3 weeks before Julia died. Dan, if Liam is giving you this, it means you need to hear from me. He knows when. Kids always know. You're going to blame yourself for everything. Captain Torres, the accident that takes me, every bad thing that ever happens. That's how you love. So deeply, you think you have to protect everyone from everything. But life doesn't work that way. I don't blame you. Torres didn't blame you. Only you blame you. Liam needs a father who lives, not a ghost walking through motions. You think staying safe protects him, but what he needs is to see you be brave. To see you fall down and get back up. To see you scared and do it anyway. I loved you because you cared so much, not despite it. Now care about the right thing.
Living for Liam, not just surviving. The sky is waiting, Dan. So am I. Always. Love, Jules. Dan read the letter 4 times before the words stopped blurring. His face was wet. His chest felt like someone had cracked it open and exposed everything inside. Julia had known. Somehow she'd known exactly what he would do after she was gone. She'd written this letter like a message in a bottle, thrown across time, hoping it would reach him when he needed it most. He folded the letter carefully, slid it back into the envelope, and sat there in the kitchen until the sun came up. At 7 in the morning, Dan called Catherine. "I'll do it." Her voice was thick with sleep. "Dan?" "One condition. I train every scenario until I can't fail." There was a long pause. Then, "Deal. Monday morning. I'm bringing in the best." Another pause. "Thank you. Not just for this."
For yesterday, my father, he's going to be okay. Yes, because of you. Dan ended the call before she could say anything else. He wasn't ready for gratitude, wasn't ready for whatever this thing between them was becoming. Liam appeared in the kitchen doorway, hair sticking up in every direction. "Who are you talking to?" "Work." Liam climbed into a chair, looked at Dan with those eyes that saw too much. "Are you going to fly again? Like, really fly?" "Yeah, buddy. I think I am." Liam's face lit up with a smile that looked exactly like Julia's. "Mom would be so happy." "How do you know?" "She told me. Before she went to heaven. She said one day you'd remember you have wings." Dan's throat tightened. "When did she say that?" "The night before the accident. She made me promise to remember. She said I'd need to tell you someday." 8 years old, carrying his mother's final message for 3 years. Dan reached across the table and took his son's hand. "You've been very brave holding on to that. Mom said you'd be scared, and I had to be brave so you could be brave too." Dan couldn't speak. He just held Liam's hand and tried not to fall apart. Monday morning came faster than Dan was ready for. He arrived at the hangar at 6 before most of the staff. The mop and bucket were still in the corner where he'd left them. He looked at them for a long moment, then walked past without touching them. Catherine was waiting in the conference room with a woman Dan didn't recognize. Late 50s, gray hair pulled back tight, posture that screamed military. "Daniel Foster, this is Colonel Diane Carter, Air Force retired, former Thunderbirds precision flight instructor." The colonel extended her hand. Her grip was firm, assessing. "Captain Foster, I've heard a lot about you. Some of it I even believe." Dan shook her hand. "Ma'am?" "You flew yesterday after 3 years on the ground. Impressive." "Also reckless, illegal, and indicative of poor judgment." Dan bristled. "A woman needed help, and you provided it. Commendable. But if you're going to fly for Brennan Aerotech, you're going to do it right, which means 12 weeks of training, simulator work, emergency procedures, precision flying. By the time I'm done with you, you'll be ready for Reno." "Reno?" Catherine stepped forward. "The Reno Air Races, September. 150,000 spectators, national broadcast. We've been invited to provide a demonstration pilot." Dan looked between them. "That's 4 months away." Colonel Carter smiled. It wasn't a warm smile. "Then we'd better get started." The first week nearly broke him. Colonel Carter put him in the simulator at 8 in the morning and didn't let him out until 6 at night. Level 1 scenarios, basic emergencies, engine failures, hydraulic problems, electrical faults. things Dan had handled 1,000 times in his previous life. He failed 7 out of 10.
His timing was off. His muscle memory was there, but rusty. He second-guessed himself, hesitated at critical moments, made mistakes he never would have made before. Again. Carter's voice came through the headset after each failure. Again. And he'd run it again, and fail again. By Friday, Dan was exhausted, frustrated, and starting to wonder if Catherine had been wrong about him. Maybe he wasn't that pilot anymore. Maybe 3 years was too long. Jack found him sitting outside the hangar after a particularly brutal session. Rough day? Rough week. Jack sat down next to him, handed him a bottle of water. You know what I see when I watch you in there? A washed-up pilot who can't remember how to do his job? I see a guy who's thinking too much. You're treating every scenario like it's the one that killed Torres. You're so afraid of making a mistake that you're making mistakes. Dan took a long drink of water. How do I stop? You don't stop being afraid. You fly with it. Jack leaned back against the wall. Iraq, 2008. I had a pilot in my back seat. Good kid, 24. We took ground fire, shrapnel hit the canopy. Piece went through his neck. I had to eject us both while he was bleeding out. He died before the medevac reached us. Dan looked at him. I didn't know that. Because I don't talk about it. Spent 8 years not talking about it. You know what finally helped? Realizing that honoring him didn't mean dying with him. It meant living right. Jack stood up, offered Dan a hand. Torres didn't die so you could spend the rest of your life afraid. He died so aircraft would be safer, so other pilots wouldn't face what you two faced. The system that failed you got fixed. Hundreds of pilots are alive because of what you went through. That's Torres's legacy, not your guilt. Dan let Jack pull him to his feet. How do you know about the system fix? Because I read the engineering reports. The O2 system that failed in your aircraft? Redesigned across the entire fleet. New redundancies, new fail-safes. Your accident report saved lives. Dan had never looked at the follow-up reports, had never wanted to know what came after. The knowledge settled over him like a weight lifting. Week 2 was better. Dan stopped second-guessing, started trusting his instincts. His failure rate dropped to 3 out of 10, then 2 out of 10. By the end of the week, he was passing most scenarios on the first try. Colonel Carter didn't praise him, she just made the scenarios harder. Week 3 brought level 5, the nightmare scenario. Dual engine failure at altitude. The same sequence of alarms that had filled the cockpit the day Torres died. The first time the alarms went off, Dan froze. His hands locked on the controls. The simulator spun into an unrecoverable dive and crashed. Again. Carter's voice was neutral, professional, giving nothing away. Dan tried again. Froze again. Crashed again. Again. 15 attempts, 15 failures, each one accompanied by the sound of Torres's voice in his memory, young and terrified, and begging for help Dan couldn't give. After the 15th crash, Dan tore off the headset and walked out. He made it to the parking lot before he had to stop. His chest was too tight. He couldn't breathe. The asphalt spun under his feet. A panic attack. His therapist had warned him about these back when he'd tried therapy after Torres died. The body remembering trauma even when the mind tried to forget. Dan sat down hard on the curb, put his head between his knees, and focused on breathing. In for 4, hold for 4, out for 4. The world slowly steadied. Someone sat down next to him, not Jack this time, Catherine. She didn't say anything, just sat there, her shoulder touching his, solid and real and present. After a while, Dan's breathing normalized. I can't do it. Yes, you can. You don't understand. The alarms, I hear him every time. I hear Torres screaming and I freeze. Catherine was quiet for a moment. Then, my father had a stroke in his office, right in front of me. We were in the middle of an argument. I was telling him he was too old, too slow, holding the company back. And he just stopped, looked at me with these confused eyes, and fell. She picked at a piece of gravel on the curb. For weeks after, every time someone paused mid-sentence, my chest would seize up. Every time someone looked confused, I'd panic. My therapist said it was normal. Trauma does that, makes your brain see danger everywhere. How did you get past it? I didn't. I just learned to recognize it. Learned to say, this is my fear, not reality. And then I'd do the thing anyway. She looked at him. The alarms aren't Torres. They're just alarms. Torres is gone. You're here. And you get to choose what you do with that. Dan watched a plane take off from the runway, climbing into the afternoon sky. What if I choose wrong again? Then you'll make a different mistake than last time, but you won't make the same one, because you know what that costs. She stood up, brushed off her skirt. Colonel Carter says you have 47 attempts at level 5. Most pilots quit after 10. You're stubborn. Use that. She walked back toward the hangar, leaving Dan alone with the truth of what she'd said. Attempt 48 came the next morning. Dan strapped into the simulator, put on the headset, and waited for the nightmare. The alarms came, screaming, urgent, exactly like that day 12 years ago. Dan's hands started to freeze. Then he heard Julia's voice, not from memory, but from her letter. Care about the right thing. Living, not just surviving. And Liam's voice. Mom said you'd be scared. I had to be brave so you could be brave too. And his own voice from somewhere deep inside. This is fear, not reality. Torres is gone. You're here. Dan's hands moved. Shut down fuel to both engines. Activated fire suppression. Trimmed the aircraft for optimal glide. Found a landing zone. Calculated the approach. Set up for dead stick landing. The simulator touched down hard but intact. Stopped rolling. Alarms went silent. Dan sat in the sudden quiet, hands still on the controls, breathing hard. Carter's voice came through the headset. Pass, 48 attempts, longest I've ever seen anyone take. Also the most stubborn. A pause. Now do it again. And he did. 49. 50. Each time a little smoother, a little faster, until the fear became background noise instead of a wall. By week 4, Dan was passing level 5 on the first try. Carter moved him to precision aerobatics. This is different flying. She stood next to the simulator, arms crossed. Emergency procedures are about survival. Aerobatics are about perfection. Every degree matters. Every second counts. You'll be flying in front of 150,000 people, millions more watching broadcasts. One mistake, and you're not just dead. You're dead on national television. Comforting. I'm not here to comfort you. I'm here to make you ready. The next 6 weeks were the hardest flying Dan had ever done. Barrel rolls that had to be perfect 360-degree rotations on a single axis. Cuban eights that traced figure eights in the vertical plane with mathematical precision. Knife-edge passes 300 feet off the ground with the aircraft rotated 90 degrees, showing the crowd nothing but the jet's profile. Every maneuver had to be timed to the second, every angle measured to the degree. The margin for error was 0. Dan practiced until his body ached and his mind felt numb. 8 hours a day in the simulator, then home to Liam for dinner and homework and bedtime stories, then 2 more hours studying aerodynamics and reviewing flight recordings. Liam noticed the change in him. One night, while Dan was helping with math homework, his son looked up and said, "You're different now."
Different how? Happier. Lighter. Like you're not carrying something heavy anymore. Dan set down the pencil. I guess I'm not. Or maybe I just learned how to carry it better. Is it because you're flying? Partly. Mostly it's because I stopped being afraid of it. Mom said you'd figure it out eventually. Liam went back to his math problems like he'd just commented on the weather, not delivered another piece of Julia's wisdom from beyond the grave. Catherine started attending Dan's training sessions in week 7. She'd stand behind the glass observation window, watching, saying nothing. Dan found her presence distracting at first, then comforting, then something else he didn't have a name for. After one particularly good session, she met him outside the simulator. That was incredible. Thanks. I mean it. The barrel rolls, I've never seen anything that smooth. Carter's a good teacher. You're a good student. They stood there, suddenly awkward. The hangar bustled around them, but it felt like they were alone. Can I buy you coffee? Catherine's voice was careful, like she was testing dangerous ground. Is that appropriate? You're my employer. Technically, you haven't signed the contract yet, so technically, you still work for our janitorial service. Dan almost smiled. That's a stretch. I'm a CEO. Stretching rules is in the job description. They went to a diner 2 blocks from the hangar, sat in a booth with cracked vinyl seats, and ordered coffee that tasted like battery acid. My father wants to meet you. Catherine wrapped her hands around her mug. He keeps asking about the pilot who saved his daughter. I told him you're training for Reno. He said he wants to come watch. How's he doing? Better. Rehab is hard, but he's stubborn. Gets that from my mother. She smiled, but it faded quickly. We talk every day now. 4 years of silence, and now we can't shut up. Catching up on everything we missed. It's exhausting and wonderful, and I keep waiting for it to feel normal, but it never does. Maybe it's not supposed to feel normal. Maybe it's supposed to feel precious. Catherine looked at him across the table. When did you get wise? I'm not wise. I'm just old enough to know what happens when you waste time on pride. Is that what you did? With Torres? Partly. Mostly I wasted time on guilt that belonged to a faulty machine, not me. He took a sip of terrible coffee. Jack showed me the engineering reports. After Torres died, they redesigned the whole oxygen system. New redundancies, new fail-safes. Hundreds of pilots are alive because of what we went through. You never looked at the reports before? Couldn't. Looking at them meant thinking about it, and thinking about it meant feeling it. So I just didn't. But you're thinking about it now. Yeah. And it turns out the thinking doesn't kill you. It just hurts for a while. Then it becomes something you can live with. Catherine was quiet for a moment. I did the same thing with my father. Avoided thinking about him because thinking meant feeling guilty. Easier to just work all the time, build the company, prove him wrong about me being too aggressive. Were you? Too aggressive? Probably. But I was also right. The company needed to grow or die. He wanted to stay small and safe. We were both right in different ways, but we were too proud to admit it. She looked out the window at the street, at the cars passing by. You gave me the chance to fix it. 12 more hours and he would have been gone. I'd have spent the rest of my life knowing the last thing I said to him was cruel. You said something cruel to someone you love. Welcome to being human. Easy to say, harder to forgive yourself for. Yeah, I'm learning that. Their eyes met across the table. Something passed between them. Recognition, maybe. 2 people who'd been carrying similar weights, learning to set them down. Catherine's phone buzzed. She glanced at it and sighed. Board meeting in 20 minutes. They're going to ask about Reno. About you. Some of them think hiring a janitor as chief demonstration pilot is bad optics. What are you going to tell them? That Daniel Foster flew their CEO to her dying father when no one else could? That he passed every certification test we threw at him? That Colonel Diane Carter, who trained Thunderbirds pilots for 15 years, says he's ready? And if they still object, then they can fire me. But they won't. I own 40% of the company, and my father owns another 30%. They need us more than we need them. She stood up, left money on the table for both coffees. Sign the contract, Dan. Stop pretending you're going back to the mob. She left. Dan sat in the booth for another 10 minutes, staring at his reflection in the window. Week 11 brought the final test. Full aerobatic routine, 20 minutes. Every maneuver they'd practiced, sequenced together, performed for an audience of Brennan executives and FAA observers. Dan woke up the morning of the test with his stomach in knots. He made breakfast for Liam, packed his lunch, walked him to the bus stop. You nervous, Dad? Little bit. You'll be great. You're always great when you're flying. The bus pulled up. Liam hugged Dan tight. Mom's watching. She told me to tell you. Dan held his son for an extra second. Thanks, buddy. The demonstration was scheduled for 2 p.m. Dan arrived at the hangar at noon. Jack helped him with the pre-flight check on the Gulfstream G650 they'd modified for aerobatics. Reinforced airframe, enhanced controls, paint job that would show up against the sky. Catherine appeared in the hangar with her father. Robert Brennan was thinner than Dan had expected, moving with the careful deliberation of someone still learning to trust their body again.
But his eyes were sharp, assessing.
Mr. Foster. Robert's handshake was firm, despite the tremor. My daughter tells me you're the best pilot she's ever seen fly. High praise from someone who grew up around aircraft. I'm just trying not to crash, sir. Robert laughed. Honest. I like that. Most pilots would have flexed their ego. You're just doing the job. He looked Dan up and down. I started this company 40 years ago with one plane and a dream. Built it from nothing. Catherine took it further than I ever imagined, but she forgot something along the way. Robert glanced at his daughter. She forgot that planes exist to carry people, not just make money. You reminded her of that, so thank you. I just flew a jet, sir. You saved my daughter's life. Mine too, in a way. Don't diminish that. At 2:00, Dan climbed into the cockpit, strapped in, put on the headset. Colonel Carter's voice came through. Full routine, 20 minutes. I'll be timing you. 1 degree off on any maneuver, and you start over. Understood? Understood. One more thing, Captain. Stop flying like you're afraid to die. Start flying like you're excited to live. There's a difference. The Gulfstream rolled onto the runway. Dan could see the observation room full of executives, board members, FAA officials. Catherine stood front and center, arms crossed, face neutral. Tower, Brennan 1 requesting clearance for demonstration. Brennan 1, cleared for aerobatic demonstration. Airspace is yours. Dan pushed the throttle forward. The jet accelerated, lifted off, climbed into the clear October sky. For the first 5 minutes, everything went perfectly. Vertical climb to 8,000 feet, 4 barrel rolls, each one hitting the exact rotation points Carter had drilled into him. Cuban 8 that traced a perfect figure in the sky. The crowd below was probably impressed. Then, at minute 12, Carter sabotaged the simulation. The alarms came, both engines showing fire warnings. Dual failure at 6,000 feet during an inverted pass. Dan had 90 seconds to make a decision. Emergency protocols said to roll upright, declare Mayday, and prepare for ejection. But they were over a populated area. Ejecting meant the aircraft would crash into neighborhoods below. The other option, attempt a dead stick landing while inverted, roll upright at the last second, and pray the momentum carried them to a safe touchdown. The second option violated every safety protocol in existence. It was also the only option that wouldn't kill anyone on the ground. Dan heard Torres's voice. "Trust yourself, Captain." He made the choice. Rolling inverted to upright while descending, adjusting trim for the rotation, spotting the runway through the canopy, calculating the energy, the angle, the timing. 3,000 feet, 2,000, 1,000. Roll upright. The jet shuddered, fighting the physics. Dan's hands stayed steady. 500 feet. The runway rushed up. Main gear touched first, hard. Then nose gear. The aircraft bounced, settled, rolled to a stop. Dan sat in the cockpit, hands still on the controls, breathing like he'd run a marathon. The observation room exploded in applause. Through the window, Dan saw executives on their feet. Catherine had her hand over her mouth. Robert was clapping hard enough that Dan could hear it from the cockpit. Carter's voice came through the headset. "That was the stupidest, most brilliant piece of flying I've ever witnessed. Textbook says you should have ejected, but textbook doesn't account for the neighborhood below." She paused. "You're ready for Reno, Captain Foster. Welcome back to the sky." That night, Catherine called Dan at home. "The board approved your contract, unanimous vote. You start Monday as chief pilot." Dan sat on his couch, Liam asleep against his shoulder. "What changed their minds?" "Seeing you fly. Also, my father threatened to resign from the board if they voted no. Turns out he still has pull. Tell him thank you. Tell him yourself. He wants to have dinner. You, me, him, and Liam. Family dinner, he called it. We're not family, not yet. But I think we're becoming something." The line went quiet. "What are we becoming, Catherine?" "I don't know, but I'm curious to find out." After she hung up, Dan looked down at Liam, still asleep, still clutching his stuffed airplane. His son's face was peaceful, untroubled. The face of a child who knew his father was going to be okay. Dan pulled the blanket up over both of them and let himself imagine for the first time in 3 years what tomorrow might bring. The dinner happened on a Friday night at a steakhouse in Santa Monica. Robert had chosen the place, somewhere expensive enough to matter, but not so formal that Liam would feel uncomfortable. Dan arrived 10 minutes early, Liam's hand in his, both of them wearing the nicest clothes they owned. Catherine was already there, sitting at a corner table with her father. She dressed down from her usual CEO armor, jeans, a simple blouse, hair loose around her shoulders. She looked younger like this, less guarded. "Liam, this is Catherine, and this is her father, Mr. Brennan." Liam shook hands with both of them, polite in the way Maggie had taught him. Then he looked at Catherine with those eyes that saw too much. "Dad talks about you." Catherine smiled. "Good things, I hope. Mostly he just stares out windows and looks confused." Liam's voice was matter-of-fact, innocent. Dan felt his face heat. "Thanks for that, buddy." Robert laughed, the sound rough but genuine. "I like this kid. Honest. Sits down, son. Let's eat." The dinner should have been awkward. The CEO, her father, the pilot, and an 8-year-old. But somehow it wasn't. Robert told stories about building Brennan Aerotech from a single Cessna and a bank loan. Catherine countered with stories about her father's terrible business decisions in the early years, how they'd nearly gone bankrupt 3 times. Dad wanted to give away free flights to anyone who asked nicely. He had vision. Robert protested. He had no business sense. Catherine shot back. "I had heart. You can't put a price on that. But you can go broke because of it." Liam watched the back and forth like a tennis match, fascinated. Then he turned to Dan. "Why don't you tell stories?" "Because I'm listening." "But you have stories. Mom said you had lots of stories about flying." The table went quiet. Catherine and Robert both looked at Dan, waiting. "Your mom was generous with the truth. No, she wasn't. She said you flew planes that weren't supposed to exist yet, that you tested them to see what they could do. Liam's voice was proud, certain.
She said you were the bravest person she ever met. Dan's throat closed. He took a drink of water, tried to find words. Your mom saw the best in everyone, made them better than they were. You still have stories, though. Liam wasn't letting it go. Tell one. Dan looked at Catherine, then Robert, then back to his son. All right, one story. Then you eat your vegetables. Deal. There was a plane once, experimental design, that the engineers swore couldn't fly. Wings too small, engines too big, center of gravity all wrong. But command wanted it tested anyway. Wanted to know if their math was right or if the aircraft was smarter than the equations. Did you fly it? I did. Took her up to 20,000 feet. And the engineers were right. She didn't want to fly. Fought me the whole way up. But at altitude, something changed. The air was thinner, the resistance lower, and suddenly she was the most beautiful thing I'd ever flown. What happened? I landed her. Told command she'd work, but only at high altitude. They redesigned her as a reconnaissance bird. She flew missions for 8 years. Liam grinned. That's a good story. Eat your broccoli. Robert leaned forward. Which aircraft was that? Dan met his eyes. Can't say, sir. Still classified. Robert nodded, respect clear in his expression. Fair enough. But I'll tell you this, Captain. Any man who can make a bad bird fly good is the kind of pilot I want in my company. After dinner, Catherine walked Dan and Liam to the parking lot. Liam ran ahead, chasing moths under the streetlights. He's wonderful. Catherine watched Liam jump, trying to catch shadows. He's everything good I ever did. Julia must have been special. She was. Still is, in a way. You don't stop loving someone just because they're gone. Catherine was quiet for a moment. My mother died when I was 16. Cancer. I spent years angry at her for leaving, like she chose to go. Like she didn't fight hard enough to stay. When did the anger stop? Catherine smiled sadly. I'll let you know when it does. They stood in the warm California night, watching Liam play, both of them carrying the weight of people they'd loved and lost. Thank you for tonight. Liam needed this. So did I. Catherine's voice was soft. It's been a long time since I sat at a table and felt like part of something. What about your board meetings? Those are war councils, not family dinners. She looked at Dan. I've spent 10 years building something and forgetting why. Tonight reminded me. Liam ran back, breathless. Dad, can we come back? The food was good and Mr. Brennan is funny. We'll see, buddy. That means maybe. Liam grinned at Catherine. He says that a lot. Yeah? But he usually means yes. Catherine laughed, and the sound did something to Dan's chest that he wasn't ready to name. The weeks before Reno blurred together. Dan flew practice runs every morning, pushed the Gulfstream through the routine until he could perform it in his sleep. Colonel Carter watched every flight, noting microsecond timing errors, millimeter positioning mistakes. You're at 97% precision. She stood beside the aircraft after one session. Reno needs 99. You've got 3 weeks to find the other 2%. What's the difference between 97 and 99? The difference between good and unforgettable. You want people to watch and think, that was nice. Or you want them to watch and forget to breathe. I want them to breathe. No, you don't. You want them so locked in that they forget the world exists. That's what precision does. It makes time stop. Dan thought about that while flying the routine for the 100th time. The difference between good and great wasn't skill, it was commitment. It was the willingness to push past comfortable into territory where mistakes kill. He found the other 2% by week 11. Carter didn't smile, but she nodded once, and for her, that was a standing ovation. You're ready. She closed her notebook. Reno's in 10 days. Use the time to rest. Spend it with your son. Clear your head. The flying part is done. Now you just have to show up and do it. Catherine came to Dan's apartment that night. It was the first time she'd been there. He saw her take in the small space, the worn furniture, the photos of Julia on every surface. You keep her close. Every day. Liam needs to remember her. Catherine picked up a photo from the mantel. Julia and Dan on their wedding day, both of them laughing at something off camera. She was beautiful, inside and out. You still love her, always will. But I'm learning that love doesn't have a capacity limit. Losing her didn't use up all the love I had. Catherine set the photo down carefully. I came to tell you something. About Reno. Okay. There's a sponsor.
Orion Defense Industries. They're offering a scholarship fund to the pilot's beneficiary. $500,000 for education. Full ride through any university. Dan's breath caught. That's life-changing. I know. I wanted you to hear it from me before the press release. Liam's college, paid for, no matter what. If you fly well. If you make it through the routine. If you don't crash and die in front of 150,000 people. Catherine's voice was steady, but her eyes betrayed her. No pressure, though. Dan almost laughed. You're terrible at pep talks. I'm a CEO, not a cheerleader. She stepped closer. But I believe in you, and I'm terrified for you, and I can't decide which feeling is stronger. Belief's usually safer. Not when you care about the person. Do you? Care about me? Catherine didn't answer immediately. The apartment was quiet, except for the distant sound of Liam's music playing in his room. I think I've been caring about you since you offered to fly my jet when everyone else laughed. I just didn't have a name for it yet. And now? Now I'm standing in your apartment looking at pictures of your dead wife and realizing I'm falling for a man who's about to risk his life on national television for my company's reputation and his son's future. So yes, I care. Inconveniently, probably stupidly, but definitely. Dan crossed the space between them, kissed her, soft at first, then deeper. She tasted like hope and fear and something he'd thought was gone forever. When they broke apart, Catherine was crying. Don't die in Reno. Not planning on it. Plans don't mean much at 300 feet going 400 knots. Then I'll be very careful. Promise me. Her voice cracked. I can't lose someone else. My mother, almost my father, I can't. I promise. He pulled her close, felt her shake against him. I'll fly the routine, take the applause, and come home to you and Liam. That's the plan. You can't control everything. No, but I can control my flying, and I'm very good at flying. They stood like that until Liam appeared in the hallway, rubbing sleep from his eyes. Dad? Who's here? It's Catherine, buddy. She just stopped by to talk about work. Liam looked at them, at how close they were standing, and smiled. Okay. Can she stay for breakfast? It's 9 at night. Then can she stay until breakfast? Catherine laughed through her tears. I'd like that. The flight to Reno happened 5 days later. Dan, Liam, Catherine, Robert, Maggie, and Jack. First-class tickets on a commercial flight because Catherine insisted Dan not expend energy flying before the demonstration.
Liam pressed his face to the window during takeoff, watching the ground fall away.
This is so cool. We're flying and you're not even driving.
Piloting.
Whatever, still cool.
Robert sat across the aisle, looking healthier than he had at dinner. The rehab was working. He'd regained most of his mobility, the tremor in his hands nearly gone. Nervous, Captain? Terrified, sir. Good. Fear keeps you sharp. Complacency kills. That's what my instructor says. Smart woman. You should listen to her. Robert pulled out a tablet, showed Dan an article. Reno Press is excited. They're calling you the comeback story of the year. Former Air Force legend returns to flying after personal tragedy. Very dramatic. I'd prefer less drama and more boring. Boring doesn't sell tickets, Robert grinned. But between you and me, I've seen the betting pools. You're favored to be the highlight of the weekend. What if I mess up? Then you'll be the cautionary tale instead. But you won't mess up. Men like you don't forget how to fly. It's in your DNA. Reno Stead Airport sat north of the city, surrounded by high desert and mountains. The airshow grounds sprawled for miles. Static displays of military aircraft, commercial jets, vintage warbirds, vendors selling everything from model planes to flight jackets. And people. Everywhere, people. Families with kids, aviation enthusiasts with cameras, veterans wearing squadron patches from wars Dan remembered. The demonstration was scheduled for Saturday afternoon, prime time, maximum crowd. Dan spent Friday walking the grounds, getting a feel for the space, checking sight lines and wind patterns. Colonel Carter found him standing at the edge of the runway, staring at the sky. Visualizing? Trying to. Stop trying. Start knowing. You've flown this routine 100 times. Your body knows what to do. Trust it. What if something goes wrong? Then you adapt. That's what test pilots do. That's what you were trained for. She looked at him. Tomorrow, 150,000 people will watch you fly. But you're not flying for them. You're flying for Torres, for Julia, for Liam, for everyone who believed you could do this when you didn't believe in yourself. No pressure. Carter actually smiled. All the pressure. Welcome back to the big show, Captain. That night, Dan couldn't sleep. He lay in the hotel bed, staring at the ceiling, running the routine through his mind. Takeoff, vertical climb, barrel rolls, Cuban 8, knife edge pass, hammerhead turn, everything timed, everything perfect. His phone buzzed. A text from Catherine. Can't sleep either. Meet me on the roof? Dan slipped out of the room quietly, took the elevator to the top floor. The roof access was supposed to be locked, but someone had propped the door open. Catherine sat on a deck chair, wrapped in a jacket, looking at the stars. You should be sleeping. So should you. He sat next to her. Can't stop thinking about tomorrow. Me either. I keep running scenarios. What if the weather changes? What if equipment fails? What if you... I'll be fine. You don't know that. No, but I choose to believe it. Catherine turned to look at him. When I was 16 and my mother was dying, I made deals with God. I'll give up anything, be anyone, just let her live. But she died anyway, and I learned that deals don't work, that bad things happen no matter how good you are or how hard you pray. That's bleak. That's life. But here's what I also learned. You can't control what happens. You can only control how you respond. And I'm choosing to believe that tomorrow you'll fly beautifully and come home safe, because the alternative is too painful to consider. Dan took her hand. I'm going to do everything exactly right, follow every protocol, fly every maneuver by the book. And at the end, I'm going to land that jet and take you to dinner. Promise? Promise.
They sat on the roof until dawn, watching the stars fade and the sun rise over the Nevada desert. Saturday arrived with perfect weather. Clear skies, light winds, visibility unlimited. Dan went through pre-flight checks with Jack, methodical and thorough. Every system green, every gauge reading normal. The crowd started arriving at noon. By 1 o'clock, the grandstands were packed. By 2, people stood 10 deep behind the barriers. Dan could see them from the cockpit, thousands of faces looking up, waiting. Catherine appeared at the aircraft stairs. "Liam wants to see you before you go." His son climbed up, still small enough that the steps were a challenge. He threw his arms around Dan's neck. "You're going to be amazing." "Thanks, buddy." "Mom visited me last night. In a dream." Dan's chest tightened. "Yeah?" "She said to tell you something. She said the sky is home, and it's time to go home." Liam pulled back, looked at Dan with complete certainty. "So go home, Dad." The announcement came over the loudspeakers. Dan's name, his history. The crowd cheered. Catherine kissed him once, quick and fierce, then climbed down. Liam waved from the tarmac. Jack strapped into the co-pilot seat. "Your show, Captain." "I'm just here to watch." Dan pulled on his helmet, clicked the oxygen mask into place. "Tower, Brennan 1, requesting clearance for demonstration." "Brennan 1, you are cleared. Runway 26, winds 240 at 12. The sky is yours." Dan released the brakes. The Gulfstream rolled forward, picked up speed, lifted into the impossible blue. The first 15 minutes went exactly as planned. Vertical climb that brought gasps from the crowd. Barrel rolls executed with mechanical precision. Cuban 8 traced against the sky like an equation made visible. Dan fell into the rhythm of it. The G-forces, the stick pressure, the way the aircraft responded to his smallest input. This was what he'd been born to do. Not just fly, but dance with physics at the edge of possibility. The knife edge pass came at minute 10. Dan rolled the jet 90 degrees, showed the crowd nothing but the aircraft's profile, held it for the length of the runway at 300 feet. The risk was enormous, the margin for error measured in inches. He pulled out of it perfectly. The crowd roared. Dan could hear it even through the helmet, through the engine noise, through everything. 2 more maneuvers. Hammerhead turn, inverted flight, then landing. 5 minutes and he'd be done. The hammerhead came at minute 12. Vertical climb to stall point, pivot on the axis, dive straight down. Dan pulled the nose up, climbed, felt the airspeed bleed off as the aircraft approached stall. At the apex, something hit the engine, a sound like a gunshot. Warning lights flooded the panel. Engine 2, fire. Tower, Brennan 1, showing fire warning engine 2, advise. Brennan 1, radar confirms bird strike. Recommend you abort demonstration and land immediately. Dan looked at the gauges. Engine 2 was losing power, but not catastrophically. Engine 1 was fine. The fire suppression system was activated. He had maybe 3 minutes before the damage spread. 3 minutes. He could land in 3 minutes. Abort the demonstration, follow protocol, walk away. Or he could finish. Complete the routine on one engine, give the crowd what they came for. Show Liam that promises meant something. Secure the scholarship that would change his son's life. The choice took 2 seconds. Negative abort, Tower. Continuing demonstration on one engine. Modifying routine for power loss. Brennan 1, that is not advisable. You are cleared for emergency landing. Acknowledged. Continuing anyway. In the crowd below, Catherine stood frozen. She could see the smoke trailing from the engine, could hear the tower communications over the loudspeakers, could feel her heart trying to beat out of her chest. Robert grabbed her arm. He knows what he's doing. He's going to die. No, he's going to finish. And Robert was right, because Dan was already adapting the routine, cutting the inverted segment, modifying the final loop, compensating for the power loss with angle and momentum. The last 3 minutes were the most beautiful flying Catherine had ever seen. Not because it was perfect, but because it was real. A man and a machine, both damaged, both fighting physics, and winning. Dan lined up for final approach. One engine, smoke trailing, warning lights screaming. The runway stretched ahead, narrow and unforgiving. He dropped the landing gear, adjusted for the crosswind, corrected for the asymmetric thrust. 50 feet. 30. 20. The wheels touched. Gentle. Controlled. The jet rolled to a stop. The crowd exploded. Sound like a physical thing, washing over everything. 150,000 people on their feet, screaming, throwing hats, waving flags. Dan sat in the cockpit, hands still on the controls, unable to believe he was alive. Jack unbuckled, clapped him on the shoulder. That was the stupidest, bravest thing I've ever seen. Which one was it? Both. Definitely both. The fire trucks surrounded the aircraft. Emergency crews extinguished the engine fire. Dan climbed out to chaos. Press everywhere, cameras flashing, questions shouted from every direction. Then Liam broke through. Security tried to stop him, but he was small and fast and determined. He ran across the tarmac, launched himself at Dan. "You did it! The engine was on fire and you still did it!" Dan caught him, held him like an anchor to reality. "Yeah, buddy. I did it." Catherine reached them next. She didn't say anything, just put her arms around both of them and held on. A man in an expensive suit approached, Orion Defense Industries logo on his lapel. Captain Foster. "That was extraordinary. Engine failure mid-demonstration, and you not only completed the routine, but stuck the landing. In 30 years of sponsoring aviation events, I've never seen anything like it." He extended his hand. "Orion is honoring the scholarship commitment. $500,000. But given the circumstances, we're doubling it. $1 million for your son's education." The words didn't make sense at first. Dan looked at Catherine. She was crying. At Liam, who was grinning. At Jack, who was nodding. At the crowd still cheering in the background. $1 million. College paid for. Graduate school. Whatever Liam wanted. All because Dan had chosen to finish instead of quit. "Thank you, sir." His voice came out rough. "Thank you." The press conference happened an hour later. Dan sat at a table with Catherine, Robert, and the Orion representative. Cameras everywhere. Questions coming faster than he could answer. "Captain Foster, what went through your mind when the engine caught fire?" "That I had a choice. Safe or right. I chose right." "Weren't you afraid?" "Terrified. But fear doesn't mean stop. It means be careful." "What would you say to other pilots facing similar situations?" "Trust your training. Trust your instincts. And remember that courage isn't the absence of fear. It's doing the thing anyway, because someone depends on you." One reporter stood up. "Captain, I looked into your history. You haven't flown professionally in 3 years. What changed?" Dan thought about Torres, about Julia, about Liam's face when he'd said Mom would be happy, about Catherine standing in his apartment saying she cared. "I stopped running from the past, started running toward the future. Turns out they're not that different. You just changed direction." 6 months later, Dan stood in front of 40 teenagers on the first day of the Ryan Torres Flight Academy. The room that had been empty when he mopped floors was now filled with desks, computers, and flight simulators. On the wall hung a banner with Torres's photo, young and smiling in his flight suit. The students came from neighborhoods Dan knew, places where opportunities were scarce and dreams often died young. Ashley Brooks sat in the front row, 16 years old, daughter of a single mother, eyes sharp with hunger to learn. My name is Captain Daniel Foster. Dan's voice carried across the room. 18 months ago, I was mopping floors in this hangar. Some of you might have seen me, probably didn't. I was invisible. He gestured to the mop still leaning in the corner outside. I mopped because I was afraid. Afraid to fly, afraid to fail, afraid to lose people I loved. Captain Ryan Torres died 12 years ago in an aircraft I was piloting. I blamed myself.
Spent 11 years hiding. Dan pointed to Torres's photo. This academy is named for a man who taught me that legacy isn't about how long you live. It's about how deeply you impact others. Torres died, but the system that failed us got redesigned. Hundreds of pilots are alive because of what we went through. He looked at each student. You're here because you deserve the sky. Your background doesn't matter. Money doesn't matter. Only heart and work matter. Ashley raised her hand. What if we're scared? Dan smiled. Then you're perfect for this job. The best pilots know fear. They fly anyway. Jack Morrison entered from the side door, carrying a box of tools. Morning, Captain. Ready to teach these kids how to not break my engines? The students laughed. The ice broke. The first day of the Torres Academy had begun. Over the next months, Dan watched 40 teenagers transform. Ashley excelled at systems analysis. Tyler Mitchell struggled with simulator work, but showed brilliance in mechanical theory. Jordan Hayes had natural stick and rudder skills that reminded Dan of himself at that age. 5 students dropped out. The work was too hard, the hours too long. But 35 stayed. They showed up early, stayed late, asked questions that forced Dan to research answers he'd forgotten. Robert came twice a week to teach aviation business principles. Colonel Carter consulted remotely on aerobatics. Catherine provided funding and connections, opening doors that had been locked to kids from their backgrounds. One afternoon, Dan found Ashley sitting alone in the simulator after hours, running emergency procedures. You okay? She wiped her eyes quickly. Failed level 4 again. 10th time. Dan sat in the instructor seat. I failed level 5 47 times. Ashley looked at him. Seriously? Seriously. Want to know why I kept trying? Why? Because failure isn't the end. Quitting is.
Every failure teaches you something. You just have to stay long enough to learn it. What if I'm not good enough? You flew a perfect approach yesterday. You solved that hydraulic problem faster than Jack. You're good enough. You just don't believe it yet. Ashley ran the scenario again, failed again, but her technique improved. Dan could see it. By week 8, she passed level 4. By week 12, she was helping other students. On a Friday evening 3 months into the academy, Catherine found Dan in his office reviewing student progress reports. You look happy. I am. Ashley got accepted to MIT. Full scholarship. Aerospace engineering. That's wonderful. She's the first, but there will be more. Tyler's applying to Cal Poly. Jordan's talking to Air Force recruiters. Catherine sat on the edge of his desk. You're changing lives. We're changing lives. You funded this. You made it possible. I just wrote checks. You're doing the actual work. She reached out, took his hand. I've been thinking about something. Yeah? That promise you made on the roof in Reno. About coming home safe and taking me to dinner. Dan smiled. I kept that promise. You did. So now I'm thinking about other promises. Long-term ones. Like what? Catherine slid off the desk, reached into her pocket. Like this. She held out a ring box. Simple, elegant. Inside, a silver band with 2 wings engraved on it. Wait. Dan stood up. You're proposing to me? You proposed to me once in a hangar as a cruel joke. I'm proposing for real. Daniel Foster, will you marry me?
Dan laughed, pulled her close. That's not how this is supposed to work. Says who? Says tradition. Tradition also says the man pays for everything and the woman stays home. We're not very traditional. No, we're not. He kissed her. So is that a yes? That's a yes. But I have one condition. Catherine raised an eyebrow. What? Let me propose back. Properly. Deal. Dan took the ring, slid it onto his own finger.
This is beautiful, but it's going on the wrong hand. He pulled out his phone, sent a quick text. 2 minutes later, Liam ran into the office, followed by Maggie.
Is it happening? Is it happening?
Liam bounced with excitement. It's happening. Dan knelt down, pulled out a ring box he'd been carrying for 2 weeks. Catherine Brennan. You saw me when I was invisible. You believed in me when I'd stopped believing in myself. You gave me wings again. He opened the box. A diamond ring, simple and perfect. Fly with me forever. Be Liam's mother. Be my partner. Be my home. Catherine was crying. You already had a ring. I've had it for a month. Was waiting for the right moment. And I ruined it by proposing first. You made it better by proposing first. She pulled him up, kissed him. Yes, to all of it. Yes. Liam cheered. Maggie dabbed her eyes with a tissue. Does this mean I get a mom again? Catherine knelt to Liam's level. I can't replace your first mom. No one can. But I can be another person who loves you. Liam threw his arms around her neck. Mom told me you were coming. In my dreams. She said you'd make Dad happy. Catherine held him, tears streaming. I'll do my best. The wedding happened in the hangar 3 months later. 50 people, the Gulf Stream as backdrop. Torres's photo on a table near the altar, a reminder of where this had all started. Robert walked Catherine down the aisle. His steps were strong now, no tremor, just a father giving away his daughter to a man he respected. Liam carried the rings with the concentration of a pilot on final approach. Jack stood as best man. Ashley and the other academy students filled the front rows. The ceremony was simple, no elaborate vows, just promises that mattered. I promise to fly with you through smooth air and storms. Dan's voice was steady. I promise to see you, always. Catherine smiled through tears. I promise to remind you you're not invisible. That you never were. They exchanged rings, kissed to applause that echoed through the hangar. Robert raised a glass for the toast. 40 years ago, I built this company with one plane and a dream. My daughter turned it into an empire. Dan reminded us both why we started. Planes exist to connect people, to bring families together, to make the impossible possible. He looked at Dan and Catherine. To second chances, to stubborn pilots, to my daughter finding someone worthy of her. The reception flowed into evening. Students performed a surprise presentation, a video montage of their first flights, first solo landings, acceptance letters to schools they'd never dreamed of reaching. Ashley spoke for the group. Captain Foster taught us that where we start doesn't determine where we finish. The past is information, not destiny. Thank you, Captain. Thank you, Mrs. Foster. Near midnight, Dan and Catherine left. They had a flight to catch. The Gulfstream waited on the tarmac. Dan in the left seat, Catherine in the right, flying east toward sunrise. Where are we going? Catherine's voice came through the headset. Home. We just left home. Home is wherever we decide to land. They flew through the night. Over Nevada, over Utah, over Colorado. The land dark below, stars bright above. The sun rose over Kansas,
gold and pink spilling across the horizon. Catherine slept in the co-pilot seat, head against the window, face peaceful. Dan thought about Torres, about Julia, about everyone he'd loved and lost. They were gone, but present, living in every choice he made, every student he taught, every time he looked at Liam and saw Julia's eyes. The past had shaped him, even the painful parts, especially the painful parts. Pain taught what mattered, showed what was worth fighting for. He reached over, took Catherine's hand. She stirred, smiled at him. "Hey, pilot." "Hey, co-pilot." Down below, across America, 40 students from the Torres Academy were waking up,
Getting ready for flight lessons, dreaming their own impossible dreams. The legacy wasn't money or fame or perfect landings. It was this: people believing in themselves because someone believed in them first. Hope extending forward, link by link, generation to generation. Dan had spent 3 years invisible, but that man was gone. In his place was a pilot, husband, teacher, father. A man who'd learned that courage wasn't absence of fear, but the choice to keep flying anyway. The Gulf Stream climbed higher. The world turned, and they flew toward home together.